Let's talk now in greater detail about the concept of culture we use in this course. As I mentioned earlier, we discuss and conceptualize culture as dominant images that challenge people. This approach to culture is designed for a world dominated by experiences of globalization. It differs in important respects from the concept that is regularly used in Euro-American contexts, in the news media, and in everyday life. I would like first to go through this current popular image to illustrate for you from where it came, how it developed, and what are its strengths and fundamental limitations. Think for a minute about how you might use the concept of culture. Can you name a few cultures around the world? Can you speak a few sentences using the word culture in ways you might often hear? Might you talk, for example, about Japanese culture, American culture, or say French culture? Probably when you talk about cultures, you are speaking or thinking about cultures as something akin to membership groups. That is, people are members of cultures. The key to such membership lies in what anthropologists call the concept of sharedness. All members of a culture are thought to share something in common. There are many ways of describing what is shared by members of a culture. One common way is to say that a culture is characterized by shared beliefs and values. That is, all members of a culture share certain beliefs and values. The importance of shared beliefs and values lies in where they are located. That is, they underlie what we say and what we do. They are down below. They are in some ways and in some sense fundamental to the society in question. For example, if we are talking about Japanese culture, we would say that shared Japanese beliefs and values underlie what people in Japan say and do. So think about this popular image of culture as referring to something that is down deep. Culture consists of fundamental assumptions, fundamental beliefs and values that are located somewhere deep in your gut. By asserting or implying that cultures are both shared and underlying, we are also implying that cultures are difficult to change. Think about it. How do you change your fundamental assumptions? How do you change society's fundamental beliefs and values? How do you change something that's foundational to society and lives deep in your gut? This popular image of culture carries the sense that culture change somehow requires fundamental restructuring. Now let's step back for a moment and explore how this concept emerged. This particular interpretation of the word culture was advanced by American anthropologists in the early part of the 20th century, particularly during the 1930s and 1940s. At the time, the change was an important innovation. Earlier, in the 19th century, the world had still been organized pretty much through a set of colonial powers, European nation-states in particular. The British, French, Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese were colonial powers. A small set of very powerful countries had set up colonies all over the world. One could picture or map much of the world as a huge collection of colonies with umbilical links back to Western Europe, from where the colonial nation-state exerted its authority and control. During this period, the primary theory of human beings, societies, and indeed societal development, could be characterized with the term unilinear evolution. The central argument was that all societies were progressing or evolving along roughly a straight line. One could compare all the societies of the world or map all the societies of the world with a simple straight line, a straight line ending with an arrow at the top. Anthropological theorists, as well as others attempting to compare societies, competed with one another to sort out the key features that led one society to evolve into another. These researchers produced all sorts of models or classifications of the world's societies based upon their level of progress. Might you be able to guess which type of society was at the top? Indeed, it was the industrialized West that was always on top. Down below us were other kinds of societies. For example, agricultural societies, horticultural societies. Horticulture refers to the use of digging sticks rather than a plow. Below these were primitive or even savage societies. So the whole theory of primitive life developed during this time period. And it fit a world characterized by colonial relations. The colonial nations were out civilizing the world, and they were helping the lower societies advance into higher states of being. In the 20th century, the world changed as these colonies, one by one and sometimes collectively, sought and achieved independence from European nations. The map of the world as a set of European nation-states and non-European colonies was gradually transformed into a world that is populated by a collection of independent nation-states. The whole idea that the societies of the world could be seen in evolutionary terms didn't fit very well with the fact of independent nation-states. Think of yourself as existing in one of these newly independent nation-states and hearing someone tell you that your society is located lower on some evolutionary scale, lower than the society from which you just gained your independence. It became clear that such arguments were clearly ethnocentric. Do you have any idea what this word ethnocentric means? Once, when I asked this question in class, a student raised his hand and said, "It involves seeing your own society and your own beliefs as the center of the world and as the only true beliefs." That is indeed a reasonable approximation of what this term means. Now, if you didn't know what ethnocentric means, that's okay. When I was in my last year of college and competing for a graduate fellowship to go to England, I had to meet with a faculty committee for an interview. I was explaining that I was interested in somehow building a greater understanding across cultural boundaries through including engineering, when a faculty member looked at me and said, "Do you mean we are ethnocentric?" Well, I had never heard that word before, and the way he said it didn't really indicate whether he was pleased or mad. I fumbled around a little bit until finally he said, "I'm just trying to help you here." So I said, "Well, yes, we are ethnocentric," and then continued with my argument about building relations across cultural boundaries. To apply the theory of unilinear evolution in the context of a world of independent nation-states was arguably intensely ethnocentric. By the 1930s and 1940s in the United States, many anthropologists were traveling around the world attempting to figure out what takes place in other, meaning non-Western, societies. Several students of the German-American anthropologist Franz Boas of Columbia University elaborated the new, very American concept of culture. Two of the most well-known were Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead. Benedict wrote a famous book called Patterns of Culture, which sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 800,000 copies, a huge number for an academic book for which 5,000 would normally be a large print run. Mead, who is perhaps the most famous anthropologist in the history of the discipline, published the book Coming of Age in Samoa, which argued, shockingly, that Samoan girls did not experience the great stress, especially regarding sexuality, that was associated with adolescence in the United States. By reaching large popular audiences, both books played a significant role in training Americans to see life in other places as simply different from life in the United States. No longer organizing the world by a principle of unilinear evolution, the new concept of culture envisioned a world populated by a large set of discrete and independent cultures. That is, every country had its own culture or perhaps set of cultures. To visualize this, put aside that straight line and picture the globe with lots of little circles all over it, circles that did not overlap. Each circle was a discrete culture that developed autonomously, was independent of other cultures, and carried its own fundamental, foundational beliefs and values. In the United States, the new concept enhanced the appreciation Americans had for other societies. It enabled Americans to develop an interest in people from countries that previously might have been uninteresting because they were lower on an evolutionary scale. No longer lower, but simply different, these societies became worthy of study in their own right. Each society had a culture and people who were members of that culture. Rapidly spreading across the emergent discipline of cultural anthropology, the concept of culture grounded the work of anthropologists who traveled around the world, plopped themselves down in one culture after another, and then came back to report on life inside that culture. Such involved describing in systematic ways the fundamental beliefs and values, the way of life, and then later, the symbolic structure of meanings in that culture. This work carried the assumption that all members of a culture shared its fundamental meanings, in the same sense that all speakers of a language share an understanding of grammar. The concept also spread across disciplinary boundaries into other disciplines, and then outside the academy into popular life. It worked its way into everyday speech and language until we got to the point of routinely seeing the world as separate cultures. But the world changed again. So important in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and possibly even the 60s, the concept was losing its value by the 1970s. A huge limitation emerged. Whereas the concept was enormously helpful at calling attention to differences across cultural boundaries, so, for example, to compare life and meanings and understandings across cultural boundaries, it tended to make invisible differences within a culture, differences among the members of a culture. Once in class, when I asked students to name some different cultures, one student said, "Asian culture." I used this suggestion as an opportunity to joke around a little bit. I pointed out that according to the usual way we think about cultures, members of Asian culture must be both different from members of other cultures and fundamentally alike one another. In other words, all Asians are alike. The class of 150 students had a good many Asians and Asian American engineering students, including students born in Japan, China, and the Philippines, as well as in Virginia, North Carolina, and California. Together we had a good laugh about the viewpoint that these very different students were somehow fundamentally alike one another because of some entity called Asian culture. This difficulty in describing differences within a culture is one reason that American anthropologists, writing for English readers, have found it easier to analyze life in other cultures than in American culture. Indeed, some teachers told me that I should go study another society before studying the United States. It was difficult to convince American readers, including American anthropologists, either that all Americans are alike in any respect, or that America can easily be divided into a set of discrete and independent subcultures. Today, it's difficult to make the case that any parts of the world consist of discrete and independent cultures because people are moving rapidly around the globe. One way of talking about this is through the term diaspora, which refers to mass movements of people. Used initially to refer to mass movements of Jews around the world, it now calls attention to mass movements of all sorts. Think, for example, of the diasporic role played by graduate engineering education in the United States. Each year, thousands of engineers come to the United States to earn advanced degrees, after which they typically either return home or find a way to stay in the United States. To get a sense of the magnitude of this phenomenon, imagine that 52% of the engineers with PhDs working in the United States, U.S. industry, are foreign-born, and 20% of the total labor force in engineering is made up of foreign-born engineers. Roughly 2/3 of all H-1 visas issued in the United States are for engineering and computer science. This phenomenon can be extrapolated around the world. The United Kingdom, for example, has attracted huge numbers of engineering students from around the world, where 21% of the total enrollment, compared with 6% in the United States, in undergraduate engineering is from abroad, mainly from its former colonies of India, Malaysia, and Canada. In France, 25% of the PhDs in engineering are given to foreign-born students, usually from France's former colonies of Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Each year, thousands of people come to the United States to earn degrees, usually advanced degrees, after which they typically either return home or find another way to stay in the United States. Businesses move throughout the world looking for opportunities, taking people with them. One simply can no longer presuppose that in any given country a fundamental gut-level sharedness of any sort exists. Indeed, since in most countries of the world the elite leadership has likely earned advanced degrees from Euro-American countries, it is increasingly difficult to hypothesize that differences inside a given country are as great or greater than differences among countries. With people moving all over the world, the big question today is how do we account for hybrid people? According to the old concept of culture, someone who is raised in two cultures is a real problem, a conceptual problem, both for themselves and for those around them. How can you be someone who is fundamentally, foundationally, essentially more than one thing? Characterized by two sets of gut-level assumptions, two underlying grammars, you must be pathologically unsound, clearly schizophrenic. You probably need counseling to help you cope with moving back and forth between two or more essential identities. Well, with massive movements of people around the world, quite a few actually seem to be doing okay. Perhaps you're one of them. In fact, I would assert that you are. I am. We all are, in an important sense, hybrid cultural forms. The problem seems clearest when we are talking about disparities originating in huge geographical differences, say with Asian Americans. But the conceptual issue is no less salient for people grappling and living with significant regional differences. For example, in the state of Virginia, students find themselves grappling with differences among the emergent high-tech economy and fast-paced life of Northern Virginia, the established urban life of the Tidewater area supported by a military and tourist economy, and rural southwestern Virginia, especially low-income people from the country. Significant cultural differences arguably live inside of any university, and each person is in some way learning to deal with members and membership in more than one culture. The old concept of culture not only inhibits understanding, it can also play a conservative role, pushing us not to encourage multiple memberships, but to identify and defend individual cultures as fortresses. My culture is different from yours, don't mess with it. For these reasons, some anthropologists are abandoning the concept and are engaged in a search for concepts that better describe hybridity in the present.